Hey, leaders. In this episode of Building a Culture of Collaboration, Kurtis and I are joined by Barb Flowers, an educator turned coach with 14 years of experience in education, including 8 years as a principal and assistant principal, and host of the Principal's Handbook podcast and the Teacher Burnout podcast. Barb now dedicates her work to coaching educators who are feeling burnt out, helping them focus on their well-being and reclaim their passion for teaching.
So, in this conversation, we're excited to explore Barb's insights into the connection between self-care, resilience, and building collaborative school cultures. We'll also dive into her journey from school leadership to supporting educators through her coaching practice. So, let's get started.
Intentional and purposeful focus on building a culture of collaboration is the secret for leaders striving to make a difference. In building a culture of collaboration, Kurtis and Lorna Hewson will share simple tips, ideas, and strategies to take your organization's collaborative efforts to the next level.
Welcome to another episode of Building a Culture of Collaboration. As always, I'm Lorna Hewson, co-founder and lead learner of Jigsaw Learning.
And I'm Kurtis Hewson. Today we are joined by Barb Flowers. Barb's mission to support educator well-being is more important than ever, and we can't wait to learn from her expertise and experiences. So welcome, Barb. Great to have you with us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be on the show today.
Excellent. So we always start off just learning a little bit more than the bio that we shared off the start. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and your journey to where you are today?
Yeah, so currently I am a life coach, but I started as an elementary teacher and then became an elementary assistant principal and then a principal. And as a principal, I loved it, loved getting to support other teachers and other administrators. I had an assistant principal that I worked with. And over time, I started to feel burnout. So I had my own experience of going through burnout. And I felt this huge overwhelm. And it was kind of a turning point for me where I hired a coach for myself and really had to focus on my own well-being. I had, they're still little, but two little kids at home. My kids, when I got pregnant my first year being an administrator, and I had a 1-year-old at home. So my whole admin career was being a mom with very, very little kids. And so even now they're in second and third grade. And so it's just been, you go through that period of overwhelm and you're trying to take care of yourself, take care of the school, take care of your family. And I really had to learn good boundaries, good time management skills. And like I said, I hired a coach, learned how my thoughts create my emotions, which create the actions that I take, and became so passionate about that I decided to get certified as a coach myself and help other educators. So that has led me to where I am now, where I am now a full-time coach.
That's so exciting. And you think about how often we are seeing teachers struggle with that idea of burnout, and that it's so impactful in their own personal life, but as well in their teaching career. And you wonder, how do you get past that? And really focusing on you're taking care of everybody else, everything else, but you don't make time for yourself.
Well, and I'm sure that you've used this analogy before too of, when the oxygen masks drop from the plane, put it on yourself first, take care of yourself so that then you can take care of others, which I would imagine has been a critical insight for you.
Yeah, definitely. And I think being a leader during COVID is what had the biggest impact on me. I noticed my teachers feeling so burnout after COVID. And one of the issues that I saw, even as I just left last year, years after COVID, was that we really lost boundaries during COVID, especially in elementary where parents want to know every little thing going on in their child's classroom. We had parents who would text teachers about the smallest things at 8 o'clock at night. And so really for me, it was about protecting their boundaries and helping them learn to set boundaries and know that I, as their leader, had no expectation that they're messaging those parents. I actually would prefer them to set boundaries because I always said we need to train parents how we want to respond. If we're always available, they're going to think we're always available and they're going to just keep messaging us. And if we show them that we're not available and we have those boundaries, they will respect that. So, it's up to us to set those. And so that was a huge thing I saw with my teachers that really impacted their well-being. A parent would message them on a Sunday, and there would go their whole Sunday if the message was a nasty message. And so really working on putting up those boundaries and being okay with not being available all the time. It doesn't make you a good teacher if you are or not.
Yeah, that's
Well,
so true.
and I think this really aligns with where we're going to go in the conversation
Mhm.
of just creating clarity and systems that we can
Mhm.
then lean upon to be able to respond as you say that it's not always in the moment, but do we have clearly articulated expectations that are set out? And I think that's critical, especially when we get
Mhm.
into how we set up structures for collaboration as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was, oh, go ahead.
Um, Actually, I want you to go ahead.
Okay. That was one thing I actually worked on with my building leadership team is we created a communication guide for parents because a couple issues we had was with apps like Remind and Class Dojo, parents would message the teachers, I'm picking up my child from school. Well, they would bypass the office and then they'd come to pick up their child. Nobody would have a clue because they talked to the teacher. They didn't go through the proper channels. And so we started a communication guide where these are the things you do. Even if you have a problem, you go to the teacher. You don't email the principal right away. Chain of command. These are the systems of if you're needing to pick your kid up early, this is who you talk to. If there's an issue with them being sick, this is who you talk to. It's not all the teacher because they were using the teacher for everything, not realizing that we have different people in the building for those specific jobs. So we worked on a communication guide as a building leadership team that then I rolled out to the parents. And it was funny because everybody's like, well, aren't parents going to get mad? And I don't think parents usually get mad if you have clear expectations. And nobody said anything about it. And we could easily refer them to the guide. I mean, if anything, I would think that they were happy that they had more clarification on who to contact when.
Is
Yeah.
isn't that funny? And we
Yeah.
see that all the time of, being a little bit careful of, well, are adults going to be offended if we start giving clear directions and boundary? And our experience has been, no, it's actually quite the opposite. When there's clear expectations and, as you put it, boundaries or structures in place, we can operate much more effectively within those clear definitions of how we interact and work together.
I always said as an elementary principal that we're training these kindergarten parents, right? Like they have no idea. I had one kindergarten parent who had messaged the teacher like, "Why were you absent?" and all this stuff. And I just had a conversation one day that that's not appropriate. They don't have to explain that. That's none of your business. And she was fine and never did it again in her elementary career. It's just, I think as a kindergarten parent, you don't know. You don't know what the expectations are. You might cross a boundary, but once somebody explains it to you, then you kind of set that this is how it works. So I think being really clear is important.
So I want to take that idea of clarity and
Mhm.
turn it over then to, you've talked about the adults outside of the building, our parents and school communities within the building. What are some of the ways that you found as a leader for creating teams that truly collaborate? You and I had the chance to talk earlier today and discuss the idea that collaboration doesn't just happen naturally, to at least to the degree that it could as far as effectiveness. So love for you to just break down, how do you go about creating clarity for teams to really create truly dynamic collaboration in schools?
Yeah, I think one thing that we talked about was norms, having those norms of what that looks like. We collaborated during professional learning communities. So we tried to use pretty much every team made their own norms, but we had a set of norms that we used at staff meetings and we had a set at our building leadership team. And those building leadership team members, each person was a representative of a PLC. So they had those norms to go off of, and then they kind of customized them for their grade level. So it wasn't coming up with them from scratch, but they had an idea and then they could kind of make them whatever works for them. And they would make structures as well. So, for example, one team that was kind of an intense team that I don't know, they were just very stressed all the time. They made a rule that they have to start their meeting with a joke. They wanted a funny story or a joke to like break the ice, to get into it. Like, okay, that kind of puts down the walls of everything that we just did this morning with kids, and it releases some of that pressure. And now we can dive into talking about kids and how we can improve our instruction. So that was just something that they like to do. Other groups were really good about making sure that they brought the right data or had each other helping use the data in the computer. They were very tech savvy, our one grade level team. So it was like constantly helping each other create these systems of data where they could compare different sources of data and see how they aligned, for example, our third grade reading test data with their reading levels, with their map data, and having different data points that align. So every team, kind of based on their personality, had their own culture of how they wanted to run those meetings, but it was really cool to see how they made them their own. So
Well,
giving them that space.
yeah, I could see then too of having that secondary structure of the building leadership team where you could calibrate what's happening in each one of those teams, but not dictating. Or we often say, as leaders, don't micromanage the work that's happening in the teams, but set clear parameters around it.
Yeah, and it was great because we would come back to those building leadership team meetings, and we always talked about our PLC share outs took a long time, but we thought that they were really important because they could hear what the other ones were doing. And some of our PLCs that weren't as good at looking at data then would hear how theirs was not doing as well. And so those were the meetings I always made sure to sit in on because they needed more support. But they were able to hear from each other. Okay, our team might need to get better at this area of the PLC. I'm hearing other teams doing better at this than us. So they were kind of able to compare and then go back and lead their team better.
Well, and I think that's critical then as the building leader, you as principal, to be able to distribute that leadership in the way that you're talking about, because we know as leaders, you can't be in every meeting and try and coordinate each one of those. You have to rely on other leaders that can do that, and understanding the nuances in each group are going to be a little bit different, and each team will have different successes and challenges that they have to attend to.
Yeah, and it was really great to see how they created them on their own and how each of them ran. But it did also give each team member that leadership, and they got to step up and be a leader. And I saw a lot of people become leaders and feel more empowered that they would have never done that before.
So, Barb, that leads me to thinking about, we know that effective collaboration can be very powerful in impacting your end results, but we also believe that it has the impact on wellness for teachers as well. And so, because that's your area of expertise, would love to hear you talk a little bit about when we have effective collaboration in place, how does that impact the wellness of our staff and teams?
We'll be right back to continue this episode.
Feeling overwhelmed with the expectations being placed on teachers, leaders, and educational systems to respond to the diverse needs of our learners?
Are you wanting to take your PLCs and RTI efforts to the next level?
It definitely takes a highly coordinated framework of structures and processes to maximize the collective capacity of your team to ensure success for all students. Collaborative Response is that framework.
Order your copy of our bestseller, Collaborative Response, 3 foundational components that transform how we respond to the needs of learners, which includes access to a comprehensive companion website. Join the thousands of schools using the framework to ensure high levels of success for students and staff. And now back to our conversation.
Yeah, definitely. And I saw this myself as a teacher. When I had a good team that I could collaborate with, the workload felt so much less because we would share the planning. We would share the problems. If we had a problem, we could go to the other person, right? And collaborate with them. And you didn't feel alone, like you had to figure this out. And I also see that with the teachers that I had worked with. They have each other's support. If you have a teacher going through a tough time, we had teachers of all different age ranges. And so we had teachers who were caring for their parents who were older, and their team would just step up if they were out for long periods of time and help make sure that those kids were still getting good instruction, that the sub knew what they needed to be doing, that they could still collaborate in PLCs, talk about data, even without that teacher being there. So having those strong teams that work together are so important for teachers knowing that, I can be out, I can be sick, I can be taking care of other people, and my team will have it covered. I don't have to worry about school. And that was something as the school leader I stressed too. We focus on our families, we focus on ourselves, we'll take care of the rest at school. We're here and we'll make it work for kids.
So, Barb, with your current work, do you see a correlation between teachers that are feeling overwhelmed, high degrees of stress, and really having difficulty navigating the waters, and isolationism? Meaning, do you see a correlation between teachers that feel isolated leading to the well-being issues? Does that come up
Yes.
frequently for you?
Yeah. So I've worked with some teachers that are high school teachers who are only teaching like one subject area. So
Mm,
they don't even have other people to collaborate with. The other thing I think I would say with this is there are some people who have people to collaborate with, but maybe it's not the right collaboration. And so they
Mhm.
feed in that negative energy versus the opposite. If you have the right type of collaboration where it's based on doing what's best for kids and improving instruction and knowing that you're there to support each other, I see that as a much healthier dynamic than when we get together and we complain about how hard it is. Then it kind of is fueling that fire, and people are needing support because they're feeling so overwhelmed. One thing that I teach my clients, and I used to talk to my teachers and my staff about this too, that our thoughts do create our emotions and actions. So what thoughts are the teachers thinking about their students? What are they thinking about the work that they're doing? Did
Mm.
they lose their passion? Are they feeling burnt out? If that's the place that they're at, it can be really hard if they have other people who are also feeling that working with them. So it's having a mixture of people on that team who can help them find their passion again. One of my most collaborative teams was a team that everybody was so passionate about what they taught. And so they could fuel that with each other. They loved talking about data. It was almost, it was like their hobby where they would get together in the summer and they would plan their assessments for the year, right? And that was probably one of the healthiest team dynamics I saw because they were all on the same page about where their passion was for teaching and helping kids really learn reading and math at an early age.
yeah, that's exciting. When we think about, sometimes we have teams of teachers who get along with each other fine, like there's no personality conflicts or anything, but they actually aren't truly collaborating. What
Mhm.
what would you suggest would be a way for leaders to be able to help those teams be more effective in their collaboration?
Yeah, I think when teachers aren't truly collaborating, it really comes from a place of fear, right? A place of fear of being judged, fear of not being right or not knowing enough. A
Mhm.
lot of us, our brain automatically goes to the negative where we're judging ourselves. And a lot of us are afraid to be vulnerable and share that. And so I think one thing I always did was lead with vulnerability. Right. We
Mm.
transition in an elementary from balanced literacy to the science of reading, for example. And if schools are going through that, they know that it was a very passionate topic. Teachers in elementaries were very upset about it. Um, and really, it came from a place of fear. They were feeling insecure because here we're saying, like, you've been teaching for 20 years and it's not right, right? And
Yeah.
of course, that brings up insecurity. And so, one way that I would lead in situations like that is to start with, I was not teaching it right either, right? Like, I didn't know better either. And
Mm.
so, being that vulnerable person, I think as a principal, it is this balance between you have to be an expert and them respect you in your knowledge, but being vulnerable that, listen, this is a tough topic. Or, I did a training with specialist teachers, art, PE, music, and it was on reading. And we were going into this training, and I knew they were going to hear all these reading terms that they had no idea. So I started with, I taught reading and I didn't know these terms until I took this course. So listen to these. You're not going to know them, really being vulnerable and upfront that it's okay not to know the information. We're all learning together because when people go into a situation and they feel like they should know something or they feel like they're on the spot, that's where that insecurity comes in. And then it really fuels that negativity.
Well, and we hear that over and over. We're big
All the
believers
time.
too of model the vulnerability, because until you can be vulnerable, you're not really going to be able to establish that psychological safety that
Mhm.
that not only is it okay to say, I'm not quite sure what to do in this situation,
Yeah.
it actually becomes expected that
Right.
let go of the idea that we have to be experts in everything. None of us have this completely figured out. So how can we learn from each other?
Yeah, and I always said we have the best job working with kids because kids are so forgiving. If I taught something and it was wrong, I'd go in and be like, "Hey, I was wrong," and they just move on. They're
They're
so
okay.
resilient.
Yeah.
Yes. So, it's great.
So we know within that modeling of course is one element, but there's also going to be times where some of these difficult conversations are going to be unavoidable. That if we're truly collaborating, there are going to be difficult conversations that come. There's hard conversations that happen when you're really digging into how can we best support students. So what advice would you give leaders who struggle with having those hard conversations?
Yeah, I mean, this was an area I had to really work on myself, and so I know that it's difficult to have those hard conversations. I think one, having those relationships with teachers are huge because when I had to have a hard conversation, they knew I was coming from a genuine place where I cared about them, I cared about the kids. It wasn't me coming after them because we already had that trusting relationship. And then the other thing I would say is just practice it, but say the hard thing. Don't sugarcoat it. Just practice saying the thing that you need to say, whether you need to write it out first, talk it through with somebody. That was something else that I would do if it was going to be a really tough conversation. And then I always tried to back it in facts. So
Mm.
whether it's you're talking about data, it's not subjective. It's not, I just think this. Usually my hard conversations were, I'm looking at this data. This is what I see. Tell me about that. Or I saw this lesson. This is what our teacher evaluation rubric says. Do you have different evidence? Tell me about that. So it's all rooted in some sort of fact or evidence, not just, I would prefer if you did it this way, or, I would try to make it evidence based.
Well, and I think what's critically important in what you're sharing there, Barb, is when we can make it about the data, it's not about the person. It
Right.
it gives us
Yeah.
that little bit of distance, and now it's not a power dynamic of here's what I think is principle, and now we're playing off hierarchies and again those power dynamics, but rather this is what I'm seeing in the data. What do you think?
Well, and that becomes the difference between opinion and fact.
Mhm.
Like what
Yeah.
you have to back you up, or to, like you said, having the evidence of what you can speak to move them forward.
Yeah, and for example, that was a huge conversation with reading, right? Trying new reading strategies. People would not want to try it. And I'd say, hey, what we're doing is not getting us 80% of kids at
Right.
reading on level. So try it. We've got to try something different.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and I think pointing that out was usually some people would be offended, but it was, you can't really argue with it.
Yeah. Well, and I think this also relates to what you had shared before of, some of your teams were more advanced with the examination and responding to the data than others. I think it takes practice of being able
Hmm.
to get to a place where, as teachers, we start to have hard conversations with ourselves and with each other to be able to say, my results in my classroom are not looking I'm not seeing as much growth as they're in Lorna's classroom. And let's get away from, well, I must have the wrong group of kids or a bad group of kids to, I'd love to hear what you're doing because there's something that I'm not doing that I could be.
But in order to get to that space, we need to build cultures of collaboration with high degrees of trust.
Mm-hmm.
And being able to have people sharing what are their concerns, or what are their challenges, and being able to talk through those very open-minded.
But really, the best use of data, it should be creating questions.
Yeah.
That's the whole point, is not to evaluate or judge us, but rather our data says this, why? What could
Right. and understanding the data and making sure we have good data. Like we switched to a cadence. And so that was a little bit of a learning curve of what does this data mean? Yeah, I know what the assessment looked like, but what does that mean for kids at this age, you know? And so that was a learning curve where they really had to, it took some time to dig in and understand each piece of data and why that was important. Because we could easily say, like, for example, I've heard people say kids reading nonsense words isn't important. They're not real, but it is important. We know research says that's the foundation of them decoding words, you know? And so it's really like, it's getting that knowledge with it as well, with the assessments that we're giving and why that assessment is so important and valuable for what it's showing for our kids.
So, Barb, I love that and that connection to data. And obviously, that doesn't just happen by accident. There's some strategic and intentional planning that happens from a leadership side with that building leadership team that you were talking about. What were some other strategies that you found effective for building up the expertise of the leaders who could then go in and lead in their own teams? We'll be right back to continue this episode. Have you ever walked out of a meeting and felt that nothing was accomplished? Have you ever sat during a team meeting creating your grocery list for the end of the day? Have you ever felt like the staff of the hit TV show The Office when Michael calls everyone to the conference room? Our most valuable resource is time. When you're tasked with leading any type of a meeting, your first question should be, how do I use this time effectively for myself and for my team? This requires planning. No longer can we call over the PA, everyone meet in the staff room, we have some things to discuss. Instead, we need to invest some time in planning the meeting agenda and how we engage with our team to produce the results we are hoping to achieve. Access the free guide, 5 planning considerations to transform your team meetings, and you'll receive valuable tips to ensure your team meeting time is effective, productive, and engaging. Go to bit.ly/5 planning teams. That's number 5 planning teams, all one word. Access the guide and never again will you hear this meeting could have just been an email. And now back to our conversation.
Yeah, so we did a lot of professional development during that building leadership time. So we would maybe, some years we did a book study. Some years we would do certain professional development just in a day or read an article, talk about it. Also, along with the building leadership team, we had different committees. So we had a math committee, we had a reading committee, and in those teams too, they got professional development. There was one teacher per grade level, so they could go back and share some knowledge that they had and kind of figure out what else we needed as a staff to continue growing that. The other thing I would say too, the best thing that ever happened was we finally got a reading coach. So having coaches in the building where I could see the benefits and how amazing it was, but having that person who could come in and, you know, go into the classroom, build that trust, model for teachers, and share with them how they could improve their practice was also a huge way that we built capacity with teachers and their knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Barb, we ask a similar question of all of our guests, and so I want to be able to really reflect on especially your journey through beginning as a teacher and then moving into the work that you're now doing as life coach. But here's the question in the spirit of, if you knew then what you know now, what advice would you give to your past self in relation to establishing and sustaining highly impactful collaborative practices?
Yeah, I used to think that if I learned something new, whether it was at a PD or I collaborated and learned what other teachers were doing, that I was doing it wrong. Then when I became a principal and went in classrooms every day, I got to see that everybody does it so different and they do it with what works with their personality, and there's not a wrong way.
Yeah.
And so having that was so impactful. And I told teachers that all the time. Like, I wish I could go back to me as a new teacher who I remember doing something, changing it because I heard a different way to do it, or I read a book and I was like, oh, we talked about this would be better. But the first way I was doing was fine. And so having more confidence in what I was doing, that it's okay to do things different as long as you know it's working for your group of kids.
Well, and I think that then becomes the power of collaboration of when I'm hearing from others what's working for them, what could I bring and adopt into my practice? And it's that continual learning exchange of I'll share what I found works for me, I'll hear what works for you, and that's going to evolve my practice as well.
Yeah. And even as new teachers, you have just as much to share. You both. And I see a lot of teachers who have been teaching for years who go in and watch their teachers they're mentoring, and they're like, I learned so much from them. So it's really cool when teachers of all ages can see that from each other.
Absolutely. So, Barb, as we reach the end of the conversation, would love to hear what's the best way that our listeners could get in touch with you or learn more, or if interested in being able to utilize some of your services as well.
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn, Barb Flowers. I'm also on the Principal's Handbook, that podcast. You can find me there, or you can find me on Instagram at Barb Flowers Coaching. So those are all ways that you can find me. I do free consultations with people if they want to see how coaching helps them or just have a conversation. I love meeting educators, having conversations, seeing what they're going through and how I can support them.
All right. Well, we'll include that information into the show notes as well as your website, barbflowerscoaching.com. We'll make sure that that's there for people as well.
Thank you so much, Barb, for a wonderful conversation.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So one of the things that I love about this podcast is we get to meet and engage with people. I always walk away with something new, but then there's always confirmations. We hear similar things come up when it comes to building this culture of collaboration. I want to start with something we almost hear every time we engage in a conversation with someone, and that's around the importance of vulnerability. And as a leader, modeling that, but trying to create high degrees of vulnerability within the staff team so that it's okay to question, to feel like I'm not quite sure if I'm seeing the impact. How do you do this in your classroom? That when we get to that high levels of trust and can build that vulnerability, so important. And we hear leader after leader talk about this.
Well, and it's not even this is a nice thing to get to or a nice, side effect of collaborating, but this is a must. You need for your teams to get to that point where they are completely vulnerable with each other and that they have that freedom to be able to share their current experiences or their challenges, and that they don't have, and Barb talked lots about some of that coming from a fear base or that insecurity that's created from fear. And we need our teams to be able to get to the place where they're not fearful and that they can share what they're thinking and feeling and wondering about.
Yeah. So one perspective we could have is, okay, I'll just ensure that the people who are not vulnerable, we find ways to usher them out of the building. And I'll just make sure I hire right people for that. But we know that that's actually not the case at all. She talked about 3 really intentional things that she was doing as a leader that led to that vulnerability and that culture of collaboration. So the first was clearly articulating norms for teams.
Yeah.
And I loved that idea of we have some school-wide norms, but then each team is going to massage and adjust to fit
them a
their
bit for them
to affect their context. I think that's really key in owning those norms, and they're not just, well, the principal set these norms and this is what they said we have to do.
Well, and understanding, and Barb talked about this too, understanding that each team is going to be different because of the composition of the team members that are on that team. And so you want the flexibility of being able to name other norms that are actually going to help that particular team to be able to move forward.
Yeah. The second that I heard was putting a really intentional focus on relationships and ensuring that when I have hard conversations, and as a leader, that's an inevitability that it's going to happen, that it comes from a caring place, and being invested in knowing your team is a huge part of building those strong relationships.
Yeah, I also appreciated the fact that Barb was talking about when there are issues and you do need to have those uncomfortable conversations with someone to really be clear about surfacing the issue and naming it, talking through it, and then having that opportunity to be able to back it with facts or evidence.
So that was the third thing that I was going to come to, is that it's not based on opinions, but rather what is the data saying to us? And that's a critical part of getting comfortable with utilizing data and being able to say, well, our data says this, why?
Yeah. And then being able to have conversations about how do we address what our data is telling us, and that we need to be able to respond to what that data is saying.
So you mentioned the term being okay with being uncomfortable. And this has been one of my ahas over the last little while, is when we are truly collaborating, there should be a sense of discomfort, a certain level of tension. Now, if it's too much discomfort or tension, that obviously is going to have negative impacts. But if we're truly collaborating, I should be coming into those conversations just a little bit uncomfortable, because my the way I'm going about things might be challenged within those conversations, probably through self-reflection. I'm going to be challenged with it. But I don't think we want to stray or shy away from discomfort, but rather accept that it's actually one of the things that demonstrates we are truly collaborating.
Yeah. And when you find yourself in that space of cognitive dissonance, it probably means that we need to make some adjustments, or we need to find some alignment with the work of the team. And that's actually, it sounds uncomfortable, but it's actually a good space to be in, because it indicates that you are deep in thought about how you are doing the work that you're doing. And those challenges often take us to an absolutely new and positive place by the time you work through them.
Well, and I loved, and this is where we'll end off today, that idea of we're not engaging in this collaborative work as an end in itself. It's a means to ensure success for every student. And if we can keep hold to that root moral imperative of we're really doing what we're doing to impact student lives, I think that connects to what Barb says of keeping that passion and that understanding of why do we do what we do. We believe that in good collaborative staff teams, it resonates with the statement, every child deserves a team. And that's why we're doing it, because every child is going to see success through our collaborative efforts. All right. So as always, reach out if you have guests to suggest, if you have questions, and we'll make sure to link all of Barb's information into the show notes as well. Once again, it's been a pleasure being able to engage, and hope you've taken something out of this episode. So until next time, we wish you all the best.
See you soon.
Jigsaw Learning, founded by Kurtis and Lorna Hewson, is a team of educators who work with schools, districts, and educational leaders to establish collaborative response to ensure success for all students. Because every child deserves a team.